My name is Ihor Sevchenko. I'm 38. I live in the city, just the place I was born and raised, where I have a small apartment, a workshop in the basement, a few acquaintances, and some clients who pay their bills and don't ask many questions. I always thought of myself as a simple man. I work, make plans, love good coffee, and Saturday walks along the riverfront. Boring maybe, but steady. Stability was my life until she arrived. Her name was Anya. She came into my life like sunlight after a long winter. I met her in that tiny bookstore on the corner where they sold old trinkets and coffee that smelled like you needed a little more life to make everything fall into place. She smiled in a way that made me forget why I'd come in. She worked at a nearby ad agency, creative manager, always with a notebook, hair in a careless bun, a voice that could make ordinary words sound nicer. We started dating. It felt easy and natural. Dinners in the kitchen, movies on the couch, her laughing in the rain. She said she liked the way I fixed things. Something in me answered that trust. I began to think she was the one I'd been waiting for my whole life. I opened the door to my world for her. Morning coffee, my plans, little vulnerable thoughts, silly stories about work. She fit into me like a missing puzzle piece. Things started clicking, and the everyday took on new meaning. The first months were better than I could have imagined. We solved little problems, argued and made up, bought a bookshelf together and laughed when I put a screw in crooked. I shared what I usually kept to myself, an old breakup, small fears, even letters from my mother telling me not to rush. She listened. She seemed sincere. She said the words that filled blank space. I believed her, but people get too sure when things are warm. Warmth hides cracks. People learn how to look pained in the same places you are. I didn't notice it, or I didn't want to. I thought our little world would last. Then I saw the name. It happened by accident, the way the worst stories often do. I came home early, forgot a tool at the workshop, and decided to pick it up. She was in the kitchen, on a call on FaceTime, talking to a friend or a colleague, I didn't know which then. Her phone lay on the table. The screen lit up and a message flashed, a recent call, the contact name, and I saw it. Serhi, colleague. Nah, just Serhi. The name made my stomach drop, because I'd seen it in her agency's calendar before. He popped up in her schedule as a work call, but the calls had gotten more frequent. I didn't understand the scale at first. I felt a cold knot of fear. My heart skipped. The smell of coffee and detergent filled my nose, but my head went still. Such a simple moment split life into before and after. I started collecting threads, not out of vengeance at first, not to destroy, but to gather facts, because without proof words are light and empty. I did what I've always done. I took things apart, the way I take machines apart, until I can see the tiny parts others miss. I picked up her phone while she was in the shower, took a deep breath, and opened the chat. There it was, the thing I feared most. Photos, jokes, those small intimate words, couples, and when there's someone else. I remember my body going cold. The worst wasn't that she'd cheated, but that I'd been deceived for months by small daily things that stacked into the bigger lie. They laughed in messages. He wrote he couldn't wait for their time together. She sent hearts. They met at the office, went for work coffee, and on weekends silenced their phones so no one would know. I walked out of the shower with a scrap of paper in my hand, their meeting dates, photos, the gas stations where a car had stopped, chat screenshots. I felt middle cold, but that cold didn't make me weak. It focused me. People take revenge in different ways. Some scream, some pack and leave. I chose something else, the way of a man who understands structure, how an agency runs, who signs the bills, where the money comes from. I knew that public humiliation would only ripple briefly. If I wanted to hurt them where it mattered, I needed to strike at their work, their reputation, their money. If I undermined the man's career and exposed how they misused company resources for personal meetings, the losses would be real. When the job goes, You stand naked. So I made a file not out of spite, but for safety. I gathered proof, photos, messages, bank records, reports of route crossings, their meeting schedule. I hid copies in 3 places, an encrypted server, an external hard drive, and a paper copy tucked under the bench in my old workshop. Why all 3? Because those who do bad things with money and status know how to erase digital tracks. Paper is stupid but stubborn. Then I washed, not in a manic way but with cold engineering. Who enters the office? How long they stay? What cars arrive? Who accompanies them? I didn't want screams. I wanted action. I wanted their lie to have consequences. I had a plan. This wasn't impulsive fury. It was work. I took the tools that had served me all my life, patience, precision, calculation, and turned them on what had once been love. It hurt, but I knew if I didn't act now, I'd break later from helplessness. The pain of helplessness was something I refused to feel. The first night I didn't sleep. I mapped scenarios, hire a lawyer and spark a scandal. Too loud, too fast. Tell his wife. Maybe, but that wouldn't touch the firm's bookkeeping. Destroy their personal lives. It might only be temporary. I decided to act where they'd feel it most: work, reputation, money. I wanted to topple the foundations of their comfort. I knew there would be consequences. I knew there was no turning back. But I also knew I couldn't stand by. If they continued to live like nothing happened, they'd eventually hurt others too. I wouldn't let that happen. The next morning I woke with a clarity I'd never had. The plan was set. The coming days and weeks would be the arena. They didn't know their symphony of lies already had a conductor. I was that conductor. I moved like someone assembling a clock, one careful gear at a time. The truth had given me pieces. My job was to make them fit so the whole machine would turn and show the inside. Day 1. I turned the workshop into an operations center. My bench was covered in neat stacks, printouts of message threads, time-stamped photos from the nights Cal, my old friend and fixer, had supplied, copies of Elena's calendar entries, and a folder labeled professional. That last one was the knife edge. Personal betrayals burn quickly. Professional ruin lasts. I started small and legal. I nailed anonymously to a client listed on the agency's public roster. Good morning, unusual activity noted on your account. After hours vendor pickups logged under ex-contractor. Please confirm. I phrased it like a clerical question. Corporations hate ambiguity. They investigate things that smell like irregularity. Auditors live for it. Within a day, a compliance officer wrote back asking for details. I sent 2 photos. Daniel signing a late-night manifest, and the barcode from the crate we'd watched move across town. I didn't add commentary. I didn't have to. While the clients stirred, I built leverage. Cal had found that Daniel sometimes used a daytime company tablet to sign night manifests. Careful men leave habits. I sat with that habit and built a timeline. Daniel's lunch breaks that stretched over Elena's supposed late nights. License plate observations, the van routes. I cross-checked the van's route with invoices on publicly available municipal permit logs. The numbers matched in a way that mattered. It showed a pattern of private runs timed to school nights, bank holidays, and client audits. The kind of pattern auditors flagged. Next, I pressed Elena without obvious confrontation. She came home, and I asked about a meeting she'd claimed to have the next morning. Her answers were practiced. Project debrief, she said. You know how it is. I nodded, pretended to believe her like a man keeps a poker face. But in the quiet after dinner, I slid a throwaway envelope across the table. Inside, a single photo of her leaving the townhouse, the timestamp circled in red. No words. She paled but didn't break. She's not the kind to crumble publicly. I knew that. I wanted fear to land like a seed. The fear sprouted fast. That night she texted Daniel shorter phrases. The cadence changed. In my mirrored logs, his replies grew brusque. Men who run systems tighten the screws when they feel pressure. Pressure forces mistakes. I fed the mistakes in the way I knew best, exposure by protocol. I contacted a contractor relations manager at the agency under a fabricated but believable pretense, a vendor asking how to register for compliance. The manager, eager to be helpful, sent me the vendor code lists. I matched code to manifest and found a small but crucial irregularity. The line item descriptions on invoices didn't match the actual freight descriptions on municipal permits. In plain language, paperwork that lied. Paperwork is currency. You break it, you break trust. With that, I drafted a careful, anonymous packet and delivered it to 3 places at once. The agency's HR with a note about misuse of company time and client resources, an industry watchdog email, and the compliance officer at a major client we'd pinged earlier. I didn't flood them with emotion. I sent facts, dates, proof, and an offer buried in the text. If you'd like a private briefing, I can arrange sources. The places that had something to lose acted. They opened internal inquiries. Things moved faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, Elena's agency held an unscheduled audit. They pulled timesheets. They compared VPN logins to physical access logs. HR called Elena in under the pretext of a routine conversation. She came home pale and asked if she could stay at her sister's for a night. I let her go. At the same time, the client I'd nudged demanded proof from Clearwater, the logistics company listed on the manifests. They asked for receipts. They asked for explanations about after-hours pickups. Clearwater's manager, when pressed, gave the same canned answers. But the client demanded more. Copies of driver logs. That's bureaucracy at its best. Small inconveniences become big hazards when the paper trail doesn't line up. I wasn't naive. I knew this would not topple them in a single week. Men like Daniel and the board members above him are practiced in burying evidence. But a creeping audit is a hunger machine. It eats sloppiness. My job was to keep prodding until sloppiness appeared. It did. Daniel, rattled, made a critical error. He used his personal card at a service station the day after one of the audit queries. It was a tiny slip, a receipt timestamp that put him at a location he'd otherwise denied. Cal sent me the scan while I stood at the counter of my hardware store. I could have been satisfied then and there. Instead, I archived everything: receipts, logs, the manifest ties, Elena's messages. The file became a small tower of inevitability. I also tightened the legal angle. I met Anita, a litigation attorney I'd once helped when she needed a hand renovating an office. She owed me. She signed up to be an anonymous legal contact, not to file public lawsuits, but to craft the right kind of letters HR and clients can't ignore. A carefully worded letter alleging misuse of company resources and possible breaches of client contracts does what anger cannot. It spurs compliance into motion and gives auditors teeth. We sent that letter the next morning to major clients and copied it to the agency's board. It read like a procedural alarm. It didn't accuse. It asked questions and demanded documentation. The board didn't like having questions asked in public. They called an emergency meeting. In the days that followed, the pressure bent toward breaking. Elena became erratic. She called less. She answered shorter. When she did speak, I heard the tremor I'd worked to elicit earlier, not a coward's whim, but the sound of someone who knows the scaffolding is coming down. On day 8, the agency director called Daniel in. I watched from the street as he left the building, shaky, eyes hollow. The man who'd flirted with my wife through messages and late dinners looked smaller in the winter light. He was put on leave pending an investigation. That night Elena didn't come home. Her sister called me instead with a voice thick with news. Elena had resigned effective immediately and was packed at her sister's for the foreseeable. I let the silence do its work. I didn't gloat. The point was never to bask. The point was to show consequence. But consequences ripple outward. Clients panicked. Vendors combed their past runs for anomalies. Trustees wanted distance. People I had never met called my shop with worries about contracts I'd never handled. The net widened, and amid the widening net two truths stood out like nails. The first was that I had control I'd never known I possessed. The second was that the controlling of a life costs you parts of your own. I started to see the contour of what I'd set in motion. Reputation shredded, an agency hemorrhaging, trust a lover made small and afraid, good, necessary, but also a life that would never be the same, even if the immediate storm passed. The moral tally of vengeance is never neat. You remove their comfort. You remove their means. You force them to taste what 1,000 small deceits have done to others. You also become someone who keeps lists and watches feeds at midnight. That's the price. Still, the plan worked as designed. The audit led to terminations and internal probes. The client froze payments pending a deeper inquiry. Daniel's manager resigned under pressure. Elena's resignation was public. Their lives unraveled the way I'd mapped in the first nights, not with melodrama, but with paperwork, phone calls, and the small humiliations that more reliably destroy careers than a single scorching scene. I didn't celebrate. I filed copies, cross-checked logs, and moved the real archive to a more secure place. I checked the phone lines and made contingency plans for Cal and Rosa, our reporter contact, who had started to smell a larger story. We kept the pressure, not for revenge's sake alone, but to ensure the ledger of their lies stayed open long enough for the public eye to do its work. When Elena finally called to ask for a meeting, I agreed. She wanted to talk. She wanted to explain. She wanted my empathy. What she found instead was a man who had traded softness for strategy. I listened. I took in her admission, her excuses washed in tears and regret. I kept my face like someone who has learned the cost of being fooled. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said. It started as something small. Then it became a habit I finished for her. A costly one. She nodded. I know. Then you know what comes next. I left the meeting with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. My life had tilted into a new orbit. The work I'd done had consequences beyond me. I'd exposed them. Their careers cracked. My heart, oddly, felt less like a wound and more like a ledger entry, something recorded that might one day be examined. The second phase would be harder. Audits and HR moves break the scaffolding, but men like Mallory, ghosts behind funds, and influence often have back doors. You don't stop it here if you don't find the hand that feeds the machine. So I prepared for deeper digging. Shell companies, donor lists, trustee names. The next chapters would require more than emails and anonymous notes. They would require courage, favors, and go in places a man would rather not look. I cleaned my bench, filed the documents in 3 safe places, and made a cup of coffee that tasted like a small, private victory. Outside, the city hummed as if nothing had happened. Inside, the machine I'd started kept turning, and I kept winding it. When you pull at a thread long enough, you don't just see the sweater, you see the loom. That's where I was now, not satisfied with the loose ends of a fired lover and an embarrassed agency. Those were visible cuts. What I wanted was the mechanism that sustained them. The donors, the shell companies, the ledger that kept everything legitimate on paper while siphoning everything human into a private ledger of favors. I started with names. Elena had told me Garrett Mallory, a trustee, philanthropist, man with perfectly curated photos on the foundation website. And that was more than a hint. Men like Mallory are designed to be indistinguishable from civic virtue. Their charities gloss over questions. But even the most careful Fawade leaves breadcrumbs, payment trails, registered addresses, trustee minutes, mailing lists. I had the patience to follow them. First, I took my copy of the manifest photo and ran it through a forensic filter. The barcode we'd filmed came back clean. The crate's internal code had a prefix that matched a vendor contracted by Mallory's Foundation for Restricted Logistics. The vendor's public face was a bland registered name that served dozens of nonprofits. I dug into registries, pulled corporate filings, and found a pattern of small payments routed through a trust account in a neighboring state. Nothing explosive by itself, but establishing continuity is how you build a case that can't be laughed off as coincidence. Next, I leaned on favors. A list of solid favors will buy you merciless access. I called an old client, a title company director who owed me a debt from a renovation years back. He'd pulled obscure trust documents from a drawer no one thinks to look in. An accountant friend I'd helped with a tax audit gave me the routing numbers. Each person who owed me a favor handed me a new tile for the mosaic. The deeper I went, the more common the pattern. Donations made under a veneer of community outreach, routed to trusts, then rerouted through a logistics contractor. The contractor booked medical supplies or archival moves, then used vetted couriers to transport unmarked cases. Most were thinned down into harmless donations. Some contained things you didn't ask about in polite society. The ledger was a map of plausible deniability. I started building a timeline that connected Mallory to the shipments we'd been watching. Each connection was a quiet, legal thing, a donor list here, an invoice there, but together they stitched into a picture. Mallory's foundation had been paying for logistics that matched the dates of Daniel's runs. Here's what changed me from investigator to hunter. I found an internal memo, not public, leaked to me by an overworked assistant who resented the foundation's pressure, that referenced asset continuity and used language identical to the manifest codes. It suggested someone high-level was assigning tasks to the logistics firm, and the instructions were bureaucratic enough to be plausible. The assistant was terrified when I called. She wanted to stay anonymous, but wanted the truth known. She handed me a scanned copy with trembling hands. Paper, remember. Stubborn, messy, devastating. Armed with that memo, I shifted tactics. I wasn't just exposing a couple of cheating coworkers. I was unraveling a network that had used civic goodwill to hide transactions and people. That's dangerous. People who hide behind philanthropy also have friends with quiet power. People on boards, lawyers with soft voices. Bankers who prefer a discreet deposit to a nagging headline. I needed more than leaks. I needed incontrovertible proof that Mallory directly authorized irregular logistics. I needed his signature or traceable wire. For that I set a trap. It was small, surgical. I set up a fake request on behalf of a non-existent community clinic, a plausible, sympathetic front that would appeal to Mallory's donors. I registered a charity domain, drafted a professional grant proposal, and seeded it in channels where Mallory's foundation might notice: a donor list, a curated email thread, a conference where trustees convened. I did it carefully. I wanted attention, not suspicion. The bait worked. A request for emergency logistics came back as an approved initiative, and, more importantly, an authorization code that matched the foundation's payment routing. That code appeared in the logistics scheduling system the next week. When Daniel's van turned up that night to do the pickup, I had 2 cameras and 4 witnesses on record. The pickup went through under grant name tied to Mallory's donor code. The manifest listed one item. The crate packed another. I recorded the loading, the barcode scan, the driver's signature. When I cross-checked the signature against the trustee memo I'd found, the handwriting matched a scanned authorization form from Mallory's office. It would not be enough to take down a man like Mallory alone. Powerful men don't fall on single files. They fall when multiple authorities, financial, legal, media, apply pressure from different directions. So I widened the net, anonymized packets to watchdog groups, an encrypted copy of the memo to a reporter I trusted, and a call to the compliance officer at the major client who'd already inquired about irregular pickups. The goal was not to create drama, but to create a slow, bureaucratic squeeze where the money stops being quiet and becomes a liability. Of course, they noticed. After the pickup, 2 men in suits showed up at Clearwater's depot and asked questions with 2 clean voices. Mallory's PR flickered into defensive mode, bland statements about administrative oversight and third-party contractors. But under the statements, I saw panic. Trustees began canceling appearances. Lawyers asked for inventories. The foundation's ledgers stopped being invisible. Banks started asking awkward questions. They didn't retaliate publicly at first. The nice thing about people who have power is they like to preserve appearances. Their retaliation was private, clinical. I received an anonymous envelope at my workshop, a single Polaroid of me leaving Cal's truck late at night. Not explicit, but the message was clear. Someone had watched me. Cameras, surveillance, proximity, they had resources. And that was the point. The ledger had friends. Threats sharpen a person's choices. I secured my backups. I moved paper copies. I told Cal to disappear for a while. We encrypted the dossier and fed copies to 3 independent journalists across different countries. Redundancy is a small miracle in a world where people can buy erasure. Still, I underestimated how protective institutions are. Mallory's lawyers started sending formal letters cease and desist claims of libel. Banks froze accounts pending verification. The foundation issued a statement claiming inaccurate allegations. They tried to claw back the narrative toward civility and charity. Public perception is often more elastic than truth. Then the first physical bite came. Daniel's car was keyed deep down the side. A message, "Stop." A brick through Cal's window had been the first escalation. This was the second. They were not going to back down because the ledger's survival depended on silence, or at least on fear enough to keep people quiet. I felt the heat then. Exposing this would cost more than reputations. People could get hurt. That changed the ratio of risk. I had a choice. Pull back and hand them a slow victory, or press on and create a situation where the ledger's tentacles ended in a public courtroom roller. I chose the latter because the ledger had already taken from others what I loved: certainties, dignity, quiet days. I chose the only thing that felt like justice. So I shifted again. No longer satisfied with documents and manifests, I started to set up moments where men like Mallory would have to choose between a private fix and public exposure. I arranged anonymous tips that suggested the next shipment was going to a particular depot. I made sure auditors would find a mismatch. I seeded questions in donor committees until trustees started to demand audits. Bureaucracy is slow, but it eats the wealthy's tricks. And it worked in ways I didn't plan. Some trustees resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. Little things collapsed. A courier route got canceled. An invoice was delayed. A contact was too nervous to meet. Each small break weakened their confidence and tightened their risk exposure. But the ledger fights back. They upped the pressure. They hired private investigators to follow me. They pulled strings at the police. An anonymous tip about my business practices led to a brief, invasive audit of my licenses. It was legal harassment, thinly veiled. Someone wanted to scare me into silence. I told them quietly that I wouldn't be intimidated. I moved the last secure copy of the dossier off-site. I called the reporter and told her to prepare. I asked Anita to ready a formal complaint with the right jurisdictional teeth. The game had become heavy, and it would not end with paperwork alone. People I cared about were at risk, and the ledger had its claws in places that made crawling out dangerous. Night after night, I sat at the workbench and listened to the city. Each siren made me think of consequence. Each quiet morning felt like a purchased breath. I had seen them change their routines: more drivers, different vans, more careful scans. That meant our pressure was working, but it also meant we were on their radar in a real way. At the end of part 3, my list had turned into a map with names circled in red: Mallory, the logistics contractor, trustees, couriers, the unnamed lawyer who scrubbed payments. I had proof and witnesses, but that was not the same as inevitability. To make the ledger burn, I needed authorities who could turn the paper into action. I had to push them to a point where they no longer had room to maneuver behind a display of charity. So I prepared the next move: a coordinated release. Legal warrants queued with a federal contact Anita trusted. and journalists ready to publish the ledger's pattern across jurisdictions. I also braced for backlash. The ledger would not fall quietly. It would claw, it would threaten. It would try to move what it could before the door slammed shut. I kept the files close, the paper copies closer, and my hands steady. The conductor's baton was heavy now, but the orchestra was playing. The next performance would be loud. They say exposure is the cleanest weapon, that if you show enough light, the rot will simply flake off. They lie. The ledger fights back the way a wounded animal does, with whatever teeth it still has. Once I had pushed the patterns into public view, once trustees were nervous, and bank accounts got cold. The people who'd profited from plausible deniability stopped trying to argue and started trying to survive. Their survival strategies were ugly, patient, and precise. At first it was noise. A smear piece in a local blog that smelled of money, a handful of anonymous calls to clients questioning my ethics, and a thin, officious letter from Mallory's attorney accusing me of defamation. I expected that, prepared counters, legal buffers, redundant copies. But the next moves were not words. They were pressure. Cal found his Vans tires slashed one night. He drove to my shop and sat on the curb while the rain washed the salt from the pavement. He didn't look like the tough ex-cop I remembered. He looked tired, human. They want you to stop, he said. Or they want something worse. That worse arrived in small, personal packages. My storefront got a late-night visit from someone who posed as a health inspector. He asked invasive questions, took photos of the ledger pinned on my wall, and made me sign a form that looked like bureaucracy and felt like intimidation. The next morning my government account had a notice, routine audit, hours of phone calls, and a day of interrupted work later. The audit closed with nothing found, but the point had been made. They could flush my life with inconvenience until I bled patience. Then they dialed the part of the ledger that would hurt me most. My sister, who runs a small cafe across town, got a call, an accusation that her supplier had laundered funds through an account linked to my firm. Her bank froze a payment. She spent a day on hold and hung up crying. The ledger had teeth that could bite through the people peripheral to me. They used proximity as leverage. I expected them to retaliate with money and influence. I did not expect them to be so surgical with fear. The night someone left a blurred Polaroid of me outside Cal's van. The message behind it was intentional. We can follow you. No name, no signature, just the quiet knowledge that privacy is a currency they can withdraw. We escalated too. If they increased the cost, we increased the price. Anita worked through channels, building warrants, lining up prosecutors who didn't sleep when charities used civic language to cover private movement. Rosa tightened her storylines, scheduled pieces to land across 3 outlets within hours of each other. I coordinated timing with the kind of boring bureaucracy that becomes lethal when it moves at once. Subpoenas, freezing orders, trustee deposition notices. We pushed, slowly and relentlessly, until the ledger's managers had to decide between a rumor and an audit they could not ignore. It worked. For a week, trustees canceled gala appearances. A courier service cut ties. Mallory's foundation issued a bland press release promising cooperation. But someone with power learns how to compartmentalize, close the doors publicly while moving the valuables by back channels. They weren't trying to protect the ledger so much as buy time. That bought time is dangerous. In the night between one public squeeze and the next, the ledger's operators made a decision. Intimidate the squeeze's authors into silence. They tried to intimidate my friends first. Cal's girlfriend got a threatening voicemail about being the wrong kind of witness. Rose's producer received a suspicious envelope of photos meant to imply a dating scandal. The smear was old, cheap, defective, but it was meant to redirect attention from the ledger to petty gossip, to make the public doubt the messenger. Instead of silence, the attacks made us louder. Public sympathy tended to side with the small and vulnerable when the big used old tricks. People's feeds filled with support for the journalist. Donors started asking more questions of the foundation. But that didn't stop them from moving inward still. Then came the night that made me understand what we'd really been up against. I came home to find the back door ajar. The house smelled of stale breath and bleach. The boxes where I kept my paper copies were rifled through. The external drives were gone. Whoever had been in my house wasn't looking to take furniture. They'd taken the things that mattered: safe, redundant, stubborn-proof. I could have cried. I did something colder. I called Anita and told her. She sounded immediately weary and furious. "They've started seizing witnesses' assets," she said. "This is personal." She told me to go to a safe house she'd prepared months earlier and to let the police file a report. I filed the report, as they recommended, methodically, without melodrama, and then realized something. Our legal shield was only as strong as the people who would use it. If the ledger can scare witnesses into silence, the documents mean less on paper and more in court. We moved to contingency. I'd already seeded copies in 3 places. 2 were untouched. 1 copy, the one in my workshop, had been taken. 1 physical copy I'd carried in my pocket since the start was safe, folded small. The loss was personal and professional. It made the ledger feel alive in a new way, like a beast turning to bite. The raid on Mallory's storage units happened 2 weeks after the break-in. I had a small, peculiar satisfaction watching armored vans and civil process servers show up at a site that had seemed bulletproof. They found discrepancies, mismatched manifests, crates that didn't match invoices, a short ledger of off-books transfers. The news feeds lit up. Investigators find irregular logistics tied to local foundation. Mallory's PR hired a rapid response team, and the machine that had once pushed invisibility swung into damage control. Damage control came with a price. Mallory, who had been careful in public, was not careful in private. Men in his circle started pointing fingers to save themselves. 1 trustee resigned under suspicious health reasons. A logistics manager vanished. The ledger's architecture trembled, and cracks that had been hairlines widened into open seams. Then Elena disappeared. One morning after a raid, I drove by the townhouse expecting to see a note, an apology, something. The neighbors said she'd left for work early. Her sister hadn't seen her since the night before. Her phone pinged off. My calls to her sister were met with silence. I felt that old cold spread through me. Only this time it carried terror like a chemical. Anita called me at noon with a voice that had no patience left. "We have credible information she was taken by people connected to Mallory's contractors," she said. "We're moving, but you can't go running solo, Mark. They'll use her as leverage." Her words were both a permission and a prohibition. They warned me away. The ledger's operators had learned how to convert legal pressure into human currency. They'd made their move. They'd taken someone I cared about to force my hand. If I'd been naive enough to think this was about exposing documents and letting courts handle men in suits, that illusion died in that moment. The ledger was no longer an abstract thing that fed on silence. It had become a weapon aimed at the one place a man with nothing left would still give: family. So we made a choice. Anita coordinated with federal contacts, people who could move quicker than local pressure, while Rosa kept the public story alive so the ledger couldn't quietly smother Elena and vanish. Cal and I started working on the small human things, where she might be taken, who would move her through what channels. The plan wasn't elegant. It was messy and moral and desperate. I slept in my truck some nights and in a motel on others. I watched vans, the way a man watches a wound. In the end, the ledger's fight had become an ugly geometry of people, money, and fear. We had turned the machine to public view, and it had decided to bite the hands that wound it. The ledger had raised the stakes to human life. That meant there would be no half measures. There would be moves that crossed lines I once thought I'd never cross. The next step required something I'd always avoided: a direct confrontation with the ledger's infrastructure. Not just leaks and audits, but a calculated, dangerous attempt to move where the money moved, force custodians to choose between bail and truth, and to light up every dark corridor they'd used for years. It would be ugly. It might shatter more than theirs. But it was the only way to make a machine that devours people too costly to run. I tightened my coat, checked the backup drives I still had, and waited for Anita's call. She had a warrant ready if the right hand of law moved at the right time. The ledger could be cut open. If they didn't move fast, the ledger would move Elena like a pawn. When the phone rang, I answered. "Are you ready?" Anita asked. I said nothing at first. Then I heard my own voice, calm and flat. "Always. They say revenge changes shape the longer you carry it. In the beginning, it's heat, the sharp, blinding kind that makes you shake with rage. But as days become weeks and weeks stretch into months, the fire cools. It doesn't fade. It hardens. It turns into something precise, calculated, like steel sharpened to a point. By the time I made my final move, my revenge wasn't fire anymore. It was ice. Anita's call came at 3:47 a.m. "They're moving her," she said, her voice low, controlled. "We've got a ping near the docks. If we don't intercept in the next hour, she's gone." I didn't even grab a jacket. I took my old pickup, engine still coughing in the cold, and drove through empty streets, headlights carving thin paths through fog. I knew the docks, every loading bay, every warehouse. I'd worked a repair job there years ago, back when I fixed machines, not people. I knew which gates were broken, which cameras were dead. That knowledge would be my weapon now. Elena was somewhere inside Warehouse 6B, a leased property under one of Mallory's shell companies. I parked 2 blocks away. Cal met me there, his face pale under the dim streetlight. He didn't say much. He just handed me a flashlight and a crowbar inside. The air was heavy with sea salt and oil. We moved quietly between stacks of shipping crates until we saw them. 2 men by a van, one smoking, one checking his phone. I recognized the second man from a photo Rosa had sent earlier, Mallory's personal driver. The same man who'd been seen leaving her agency 2 days before. The moment our flashlights hit them, chaos broke loose. The smoker dropped his cigarette. The other reached for something under his coat. Cal tackled him before he could draw. The fight was quick, ugly, the kind of violence that doesn't belong to movies. When it was done, one man was out cold, the other on the ground wheezing. "Where is she?" I asked. He didn't answer. Cal pressed his knee against his chest, not enough to break but enough to hurt. The man's lips trembled. He nodded toward the van. I opened the back doors. She was there, Elena, bound but alive, her eyes wide, terrified, until they saw me. I'll never forget that sound she made, part cry, part relief, like she didn't believe I was real. We cut the ropes, helped her out. I could see bruises on her wrists, the marks of plastic ties. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw. I just held her. The moment felt both endless and fragile, like glass you're afraid to drop. Then I saw the second van pulling in. Headlights sliced through the dark. More men. More of Mallory's hired ghosts. Cal fired a warning shot into the air, enough to send them ducking behind crates. I grabbed Elena's hand and ran. Anita's team was minutes away, but minutes can stretch like lifetimes when you're being hunted. We ducked through a side door, down the pier, into the biting wind, off the water. We made it to the service road just as sirens echoed from the distance. Not police at first, but port security. Then came federal vehicles, unmarked, roaring in from the east gate. Anita was with them, stepping out like someone who hadn't slept in weeks but had been waiting for this moment her entire life. It was over in minutes. They arrested 3 of Mallory's men on site. The 4th fled but didn't get far. By dawn, the warehouse was sealed, and the trucks were being inventoried. Inside, they found what we'd been chasing for months: paper trails, unregistered shipments, documents tying the foundation directly to financial crimes and offshore laundering. Every signature led back to Mallory. By noon, his face was on every screen. Philanthropist under federal investigation. The man who once shook hands with mayors and smiled for cameras was now being escorted out of his mansion in handcuffs, Elena testified 2 weeks later. I was there, not beside her, but in the back of the courtroom. Her voice didn't shake. She told the truth, how Mallory used her agency for cover, how I found the proof, how she'd been threatened for knowing too much. Her words didn't absolve her. She never asked for that. But they mattered. The truth still matters, even when it comes too late. After the hearings, she came to see me. I'd moved out of my apartment and into the small house near the river, the one I used to visit to clear my head. The air smelled like pine and rain. She stood at the doorway holding her coat tight and said the words I didn't expect. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. I looked at her for a long time. Forgiveness, I said, isn't about deserving. It's about what I can live with. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. She left quietly, like someone who knew redemption wasn't always meant to be shared. As for me, I didn't go back to my old work. The tools felt different in my hands now. Instead, I started helping Anita on small investigations, cases like mine, where people had been betrayed and didn't know how to fight back. I had learned something through all of it. Vengeance is a temporary cure. Justice, real justice, is slow, patient, and deeply human. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the moment I first saw her message with Serhi's name. How everything that came after grew from that single seed of betrayal. The pain never truly goes away. It just changes form, like everything else that burns too long. I keep one thing from it all, the old folder with the word ledger scrawled on the front. It sits in a drawer in my desk, unopened for months. Not because I'm afraid of what's inside, but because it reminds me of what I've already survived. And if there's one lesson I've learned, it's this: when someone shatters your world, you can spend forever trying to glue the pieces back together, or you can use the shards to build something sharp enough to protect what's left. I chose the latter, and I've never regretted it.